Well, the national media is seized with the issue of Chinese interference in the Canadian political system, but it wasn't always that way. Even though the news, many of the facts have been out there for years, it really wasn't something that the media party dug into. You might recall that 3 years ago, I actually wrote a best selling book about it called China Virus. I wrote it in the early months of the pandemic when we were still figuring things out. Of course, the pandemic itself and the government's authoritarian response to it was part of that book, but another part, and it was sort of the wordplay that the real China's virus was not the coronavirus, but something far more persistent and perhaps dangerous, namely the Communist Party of China and Justin Trudeau's deep affection for it. In the book, I didn't do any primary research myself. By that, I mean, I didn't go to China. I didn't pore through records, and I certainly don't speak Chinese, so I couldn't track it in the native language. But I collected all the stories that had been reported before and put it all in one place. And it was rather dramatic when you add it all up. Well, in the last few months, so many more details have come out about explicit interference in our elections. CSIS, which was reporting this, the Prime Minister's office, was ignored. One hilarious statement the other day, the senior officials in our national security infrastructure said they were on vacation, so they simply missed it. It was appalling. And this has all come to a fore politically because Justin Trudeau has appointed a longtime family friend, David Johnston, the former Governor General, who himself has deep China connections. And that's the crazy thing, is that in Canada, so many senior politicians make ties with the Chinese Communist Party when they're in office, and almost as a reward for their good service, get huge financial outcomes. Let me give you a quick example before we move on to our guest today. Jean Chrétien retired as Prime Minister after a very lengthy term, you might recall. But within weeks of resigning as Prime Minister, he announced he was going to work for China in China. He still lives in Canada, but he was going to work for China and lobbying in China. Don't tell me that was only conceived and arranged after he left office. Of course, he was contemplating that and arranging that while he was still PM. You may know that his son-in-law is the head of the Desmarais family conglomerate Power Corp, major early political and financial investors in China. And so it is with Justin Trudeau, whose own brother, Sacha Trudeau, Alexandre Trudeau, published a pro-China book through the Chinese Communist Party. There's a million publishers. He could have published himself, but he chose to do so with the government of China. But all this time, my interest in this subject, my own small book on this subject, were limited by the fact that I do not know Chinese. And I found it difficult to find someone out there who could understand, read, research in the Chinese language, and yet who was not afraid to come on TV to talk about it. Over the years, I'd spoken to democracy activists, but they were terrified that they would be punished both here in Canada and their family back in China. Well, I am delighted to say that after a long search, I found someone who I actually knew as a friend who was doing the kind of work that we were looking to do for years, and she's been doing it on Twitter, tweeting up a storm about it, but not just her opinions. This is the most important thing. Rooted in facts, rooted in evidence, often taken from Chinese language media, not just media, but social media, apps like WeChat that are controlled and run by Beijing, where the pro-CCP messaging is spread to the Chinese diaspora here in Canada. Without further ado, let me introduce you to the newest contributor to Rebel News, Andrea Lee, better known on Twitter as Andy Lee. Andy, great to see you, and thanks for joining us.
Hi. It's very good to be here. Thanks. I'm very excited to be a part of the team and to be part of this project, especially, my children are Chinese Canadians. So this diaspora is very, near and dear to my heart. There's a lot of things that are going on right now in our country, and this has been going on for a long time. This isn't new, like you pointed out. It's long-standing, this interference. But it's really been brought into the light, and a lot of things have gone on for a very, very long period of time that deserve further examination. And so I've created a very good network, and a lot of them are Chinese Canadians who are within that diaspora, and we began researching articles and things like that. And so I don't do this alone. I want to point that out. I do have people who don't like to be named for obvious reasons because they're concerned about backlash. But I'm very, very proud to, have them assist me when I research and look for things, and put that forward so that people can understand what's been going on in the background for so long, because there really isn't a good coverage or examination of what's going on in our foreign language news outlets. And there's a lot going on.
Yeah. Well, what I really appreciate about your work, and I've been following it very closely on Twitter, you have over 100,000 followers, and I think there's a reason for that, is because with your team, you do read the Chinese language social media in this country, which is full of the collusion between the Liberal Party and, frankly, some conservatives and the Chinese Communist Party. And it's there in plain sight. It's just, Bob Fife and Steve Chase of the Globe and Mail. I don't think either of them speak Chinese. I'm sure they have some sources too. But every day you've been breaking news on Twitter, and it's just by digging into these social media accounts. I think it's amazing. So we're delighted that you will be not just tweeting about this stuff now, but you will be publishing it on Rebel News and doing interviews about it, and hopefully doing videos and things like that. As much as you have, and you've already in just literally the last 2 days done 2 great reports. The first was when David Johnston appeared before the House of Commons committee saying he was completely independent, and you go through his, I think how he himself has been colonized by the CCP, and you have a new one, and I just want to focus on this one. The headline for your latest is Trudeau's special rapporteur considers China his home away from home. David Johnston has made more than a dozen trips to China, saying he became attached to Nanjing during his 40-year relationship with the communist nation. Tell me some of the things you found out. I didn't know. I mean, that is an enormous number of trips to China. Tell me more of the things that I think if the Canadian public knew about David Johnston and his ties to China, they would be shocked that Trudeau appointed him to investigate ties to China.
Yeah, it was unfortunate that none of this really came out in committee yesterday. They did a lot of examination of his personal ties to Justin Trudeau and Justin Trudeau's family and the foundation, but they really didn't, go into his ties in China. Maybe that was maybe considered a no-fly zone to them. But I do think it is important because he does have very, very deep historical ties to the country. Now, that's not necessarily a nefarious thing, right? But the depth of his ties bring into question whether I think he's able to examine this issue independently and in an unbiased manner. So we know, he's visited China dozens of times. This is since, earlier on in the 80s, maybe during a different period in China where, Deng Xiaoping was in power, and things were maybe looking a little bit different for the country. There was supposed to be a period of opening up, which never was unfortunately realized. But he did receive numerous doctorates and scholarships, and his daughters attended university in China, numerous institutions in China. And he has, this isn't the first time he said it, where he's in China saying, this is like my home away from home. It seems like David Johnston has a lot of homes away from home in China. Actually, this isn't, like I said, this isn't the first instance where he said it. So Nanjing was significant, though, because that was the first official diplomatic visit between Canada and China after Xi Jinping was elected supreme leader. So his visit was of, great significance. And as well, he did forge, when he was the president of Waterloo, he did forge ties with Confucius Institutes. And Confucius Institutes were supposed to be Chinese learning centers. But, shortly after, he established those in 2006. So way, way, way back. But by 2009, our own national security officials, Michelle Juneau Katsuya, for one of them, actually wrote a book about, concerns that they were national security threats. And we know that most Confucius institutes have been ordered out of higher learning institutions because they are considered to be sort of a long arm of the PRC and exerting soft power and things like that. So they've been ordered out of the institutes. So David Johnson was integral in establishing, this institute within the university that he ran. So there's details like that were missed and not examined in committee that I think are important. He does. It was really hard to watch committee, to be honest. Because like I said, I do think that he did some groundbreaking work, and you can't just not have these institutional ties, right? It's very, very easy to say, no, we don't do business with China. But I mean, realistically speaking, it's a much more complex problem than that. But it's sort of like, how do we distance ourselves to protect ourselves and our institutions and our democratic processes? And I'm not sure that David Johnson, given the rosy colored glasses that he wears when viewing the country, and it's very obvious, he's very unapologetic about those ties, very proud with them. I'm not sure that he's the correct person to look at this through a realistic lens of how Canada-Chinese relationships, and indeed, China's relationships with other countries are in the world right now, as opposed to how they were when he, got to know the country intimately and became involved and obviously developed a very, very close affection with the country. So there's a lot of questions there, and that wasn't touched on yesterday.
That was an excerpt from the Ezra Levant show. I'm Ezra Levant. Every weekday, I do a monologue about the topic of the day. Then I interview a fascinating guest, either in studio or via Skype. And then I read your mail, whether it's fan mail or hate mail, which is sometimes even more interesting. This is on our premium service, though, called Rebel News Plus. Go to rebelnewsplus.com. It's $8 a month or less if you buy a whole year in advance. You get my show every weeknight, plus Sheila Gunn Reid's show every week. It's called The Gun Show. It's pretty amazing. We rely on you because we do not take a dime from the government. In Canada, that makes us almost unique. So please help us out and help yourself to some great journalism at rebelnewsplus.com.